This time. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Liza Oliver, Director of the Pluralism Initiative and Associate Professor of Art History. Welcome to our very final event of this academic year. I'm very happy to introduce our guest this afternoon, John McWhorter, Associate Professor of Linguistics at Columbia University. Professor McWhorter has had an extremely prolific career as both an academic and a public intellectual. He is the author, I tried to count on your Amazon site, of over 20 books. Is that correct?
Technically.
Okay, technically. Okay, there we go. 24 books, which is too many for me to list all here, so I'm going to pick some of the highlights. Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English in 2008, The Language Hoax, Why the World Looks the Same in Any Language, 2014. Talking Back, Talking Black, Truths About America's Lingua Franca, 2016. 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter, Then, Now, and Forever, 2021. Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America, also 2021. And Pronoun Trouble, The Story of Us in 7 Little Words from last year. He is also a regular contributor to the opinion pages of the New York Times. He's actually one of my favorite columns to read in the New York Times, and he writes on language and brings a classical conservative lens to issues of race, DEI, affirmative action, and yes, our 3 favorite words, the woke left. This afternoon, he will be in conversation with Kathryn Lynch, Katharine Lee Bates, and Sophie Chantal Hart Professor of English here at Wellesley. Professor Lynch is a Chaucer specialist who, in addition to her deep knowledge of and expertise in English language and literature, has been a valued and respected advocate of both academic freedom and freedom of expression more broadly on campus. So please join me in welcoming Professors Lynch and McWhorter.
Okay, this is on, good. Okay, John. The title of this event is Don't Hold Your Mouth, The Power of Language. This comes partly from a Chaucer's use of that phrase, hold your mouth, over 600 years ago. Apparently, humans have always felt that they need to, even physically, exert control over this very powerful thing, speaking words. It's one of the first things we learn as human beings, the power of words. I can remember my youngest son lying in his crib and listening to him say what he had been told in his daycare center, use your words, use your words. You have made a great career out of using your words to influence trends in society. And today's society is also one that puts a lot of emphasis on the power of language. So much so that contemporary dialogue and debate is often about what words we use to describe things. Words are conceived of as violence, even as their meanings appear slippery. No one can be sure how to define such radioactive words as apartheid, rape culture, white supremacy. People on different sides of the fence disagree about what words even mean. So words are wielded as a source of power. And yet you, a word maven and author of 24 books, are skeptical about the interconnection between culture and language, at least in its strongest versions, the idea that language determines culture. So, how do you feel about attempts to improve society by pushing for specific language change? For example, the euphemism treadmill. Do you think there's a paradox inside your career lurking there, that you're such a strong advocate for language's power, but also skeptical about the way that culture and language interconnect with each other?
Is it?
That's it.
Okay,
yeah.
so
That's the question.
okay, that's a great question.
It was a long one. It's the longest one on my list.
That's perfectly all right. The power of language is one thing, and it would be a great book title, but the truth is a lot of me being amazed by languages and their differences and how cool different languages are, a lot of it is really me being kind of an Attenborough about languages and saying this one is like this one is like this, you can express this more easily in this one. It's really all about how fascinating languages are rather than the power of. In that, for example, I have never taught a class on writing itself. And so it's not really where I stand, such that I can be as clinical as saying that Steven Pinker's idea of the euphemism treadmill is important, in that we have thought, we have cultures. These things are hard to change, and it's tempting to think that changing how we talk about them will change our thoughts. It really seems like that's the way things would work. And in some rare cases, it can, when the thoughts and the culture really were on the verge of changing anyway. So, for example, Ms. But usually, the simple fact is that using a new term or using a new expression will only seem new for 15, maybe 20 years. These days, I suspect the treadmill is going to start going faster because of social media. And it means that, for example, and it can seem clinical and even unfeeling, but right now, I'm getting into the habit of writing, at least, unhoused instead of homeless. But unhoused is a hopeless experiment, and especially as you get to a certain age and you can remember how these things went. Unhoused is going to sound just as grubby as homeless does now in about 10 minutes, because that's just the nature of how these things go. What we want to change is how many people are homeless and how someone feels about the fact that someone is homeless. Changing it won't really help, and I think we both know in that it used to be quite respectable. My mother was a social worker. She was a black social worker, and her term for what we call an unhoused person was bum. That was normal. That was textbook normal. Then that was changed to homeless, and that was very humane, and you thought, oh, it's not a bum with a bottle in his hand, it's somebody who doesn't have a home. Then homeless came to feel the same way bum did in 1975. Unhoused is going to be the same thing. And so I often say these new terms aren't going to serve the purpose that we hope they're going to. It'd be nice if they did, but it's just that language doesn't work that way. I hope that makes a certain sense.
Yeah. So basically you're saying that the attempt to change culture through language is sort of a fool's mission. It's not really going to happen.
Most of the time.
So let's move on to one such attempt through genderless language, which has been a really big issue recently, and you've written quite a bit about pronouns. And there has been quite a very concerted effort to cause people to have a less gendered view of society by using pronouns that don't mark gender in the same way. And you've pointed out that other languages do this, and that to a certain extent English itself in previous time periods has done this. But the singular they continues to be a big source of debate and kind of a lightning or third rail or lightning rod, maybe. What is your thinking right now about that pronoun? I feel like I've seen in your writings and in your conversation that maybe you've shifted a little bit.
Yeah, and I have to speak carefully because it really is, it's a delicate issue. But in English, since Chaucer, depending on how you argue about certain passages, because I'm talking to you, there has been singular they. It comes very naturally where we're not concerned with the gender in any case. And so, tell each student that they can hand in their paper whenever they want to. That's something that I think all of us would spontaneously say, and for a long time we were taught that it was wrong nevertheless. I used to not be able to write it. No editor would allow you to slip that in. And that, I thought, was silly because often we are really not thinking about gender. We even have cases like, oh, my friend is coming to the airport, and you'll say to somebody, oh, when are they coming? Because you don't know the gender and you don't really care. That's just normal. Right. But then, the new they, where the idea is that there's some people who don't want to be corralled into the gender binary, that has been more challenging because it's so very different from any place that English has ever been. So when you're using it referentially, as we say. And so my girlfriend Roberta is at the barber shop. Well, that's not where she would be. My girlfriend Roberta is spending some time in the hospital and they're getting a haircut. That's a strange situation too, but you know what I mean. So Roberta's in the hospital and they got a haircut today. The idea being not to have Roberta be a he or a she. Now, I will openly say that when that started up 10 years ago, I thought this is not what I would have expected. And it's hard to wrap my head around it because, I'm no longer exactly young. But I thought I understand what's behind it. I can imagine not wanting to be called he or she. And so I'd like to work on this. So I tried, and I noticed that younger people seem to have no problem with it at all. My girls are 11 and 14. When they were 5 and 8, they were both using they, that way with a few of the people in our building quite spontaneously. So I thought part of it is just that the brain isn't as good at it as you age, but young people will be older soon. And I wrote pronoun trouble. That's being written on my sun porch 3 years ago now. And I thought, okay, we have this new usage. Everybody needs to get used to it. I wrote a chapter all about they and the new they and how all of us needed to jump on. But the truth is, and I've been saying this with more confidence every few months, and I'm not sure whether I'm exactly right because there's no study, but I hear among my girls' friends and among Columbia students that new usage of they much less than I did 4 or 5 years ago. I think it was part of a 2020, 2021 zeitgeist, and all power to it. But I get the feeling it didn't catch on, and the reason it didn't catch on is because it might, don't strike me down, please, but it really might push cognition beyond where one would naturally want it to go. I understand that there are people who don't want to be a he or a she. I also understand, though, that it's very hard for those outside of that not to want to perceive it as being one thing or another. And so I think it pushed maybe a little too hard, and so I think its usage will be limited. I don't think it's going to take over the way I was kind of hoping it would in 23, and I think it's because sometimes you have to leave the language alone.
Yeah, it raises issues like subject-verb agreement, for example. Do you say they eats their breakfast cereal, or do you say they eat their breakfast cereal if you're talking about a singular versus a...
I wanted it to be they eats because I was trying so hard, and I thought, let's make it a little easier for those of us who are older than 14. Right. But then nobody wants they eats. Even my students at Columbia said that doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Although I had a really, I'm not patting myself on the back, but I had a good idea. If this thing was going to stick, I said, let's capitalize the T whenever it's supposed to be this new one, so that at least it's easier in print. But nobody liked that either. So,
well, one of the things that you always celebrate about language in your writing is its restlessness and how it's always in a state of change. And I do kind of want to push back on that too, because sometimes slowing down language change can have some benefits too. But the power of language is the power of language to be constantly evolving. But do you see a difference between language evolving naturally because people are just doing it spontaneously, and when censorious groups get involved and start saying, no, you have to use unhoused now instead of homeless? Or, sometimes, students in a class might even yell out if you use they improperly when you're a teacher and you've got a different generation of students that you're dealing with. Do you see a distinction between those different kinds of language change that is orchestrated, as it were, by social movements who want to make change, or as opposed to just bubbling up?
it's one of those where do you draw the line cases, because if society is changing in a certain way and a group of people decide to keep goosing that along by changing language, that strikes me as progressive, so to speak. And so the idea that I didn't sleep very much last night, folks, I'm sorry, that Gwyneth Paltrow is an actor, like to stop calling her an actress,
right,
and that Hillary Clinton is a hero, not a heroine. All of that strikes me as fine because it corresponds with what a critical mass of people are already beginning to think, and so you learn a new habit. A girlfriend taught me those in 1991. To this day, that genderless language with actor and heroine and a few others, chairperson also, it's not as deeply seated.
or just chair.
Or chair, right, that's better, actually. And so those are not as deeply seated in my mind as, say, the words chair, table, et cetera. It's an add-on, but it's there because society was going there anyway. But the idea of going from that, and it's so natural to do this, to thinking at any given time there are about 50 terms that we're going to say you need to use, and if you don't, there's something vaguely malodorous about you. That's one, it's unrealistic, it's not going to help. It's kind of mean, really. And also, and I'm going to be mean, if you make it all about language, it's a way of sidestepping actual activism.
Yeah.
So don't say that word, but then how many doors have you knocked on? How many rallies have you participated in? So, yeah, it's where do you draw the line? Some, but generally just watching the way language changes all the time, if you know what to listen for, is so much fun that why tell people what a toilet should be called or something? Like, for example, even on this campus, just walk around, as if I have, but I know you could. You walk around, listen to what has happened to the word bro, only over about the past 10 years. And so it's no longer black men calling each other brother. White men now use it all the time. My white TA yesterday, two of them, one of them gave one of them a cup of coffee, and this very white guy said, bro, thank you. But it's also becoming kind of a pronoun. And so bro doesn't know what he's doing. I have heard plenty of Columbia women saying bro doesn't know what she's doing. I have all reason to think that that's going on this campus too. That would look incomprehensible to somebody from 2000, that usage. And that word starts as brother, which is, it means somebody who's not a sister. And now it's being used as this gender neutral pronoun. To me, that's much more interesting than calling somebody unhoused.
Well, speaking of the speed of language change, so some periods of time language change is happening really fast, and some periods of time language change is happening more slowly. And in English, up until around the 18th century, when Samuel Johnson's famous dictionary was published, language change was happening really fast. And so Shakespeare would have had trouble reading Chaucer. He could have read Chaucer in the sense of understanding what he wrote, but he didn't understand the vowel shift, so he wouldn't have been able to appreciate the poetry and the rhymes. But we can read Jane Austen, and we can read George Eliot now, and it's the same time difference, because language change has been happening more slowly recently. So from the perspective of a person who studies the literature of long ago, I love static language. I want to see language change be slow. And it concerns me that I sometimes I don't know all the acronyms, I barely know what FOMO means. And
Yeah.
is that right? Fear of missing out?
But notice, I just have to think.
Yeah.
There are a lot of those lately.
So we're in a period, as you just said a minute ago with social media, of really rapid language change. Does that mean that we're going to lose the ability to read some of the great writers that just wrote, 100, 150 years ago? And should we just be content with that, or should we want to have some stability in the language?
I know what you mean, and I've never put it this way before, but language in its natural state, which is, say, in a rainforest spoken by 2,000 people, that language changes quickly, so that after even 5 or 6 generations, if you can expose people to how their great-great-grandparents talk, they'll say, oh, that's bizarre. We don't do that anymore. Language just changes because it's this constant series of misinterpretations that set in when there's no writing, and so nobody has a sense of the language having to be exactly this way. English changed much more than any language is supposed to have between Old English and Modern English because of Vikings breaking down the grammar, Celts infecting the grammar, I mean infect as in infuse the grammar, and then French and Latin adding so very many words along with Norse. And so English just flipped and turned upside down beyond what any language normally would. It has an unusual story. But once you have widespread literacy, everything really, really slows down. And that's why we don't understand as much Shakespeare as we think, but the fact that we think we get as much of it as we do, that the words have changed that little, is because now everybody can read. I know what you mean about the acronyms and the slang. I'm getting to the point. I feel like Paul Lind and Bye Bye Birdie talking about what all those kids are doing, all of that. It's like, what are you saying? What is this new expression? What is PWN? There's a whole lot of it. But a lot of that stuff is just going to kind of churn. You notice it keeps changing? A lot of them that we were talking about 10 years ago, they're not really used anymore. Remember all that talk about hashtag? Notice how that nobody cares about that anymore?
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is just on the surface, as opposed to the fact that we can... It's at the point where you can see people walking around and talking on film 100 years ago. Literally, there are things from 1923. And, we understand everything that they're saying, and that's because we have widespread literacy. They had different slang, too. Not as dense as today's, but I think slang is running around, it lays it on thick, and all of us are exposed to it, whether we're 20 or not. And that can be pretty dazzling. But the language is not going to be lost in the sense that you're saying. In 100 years, people will be able to read Donna Tartt and Jonathan Franzen. I don't know why I chose them, but they will be...
They're good ones.
They will be readable people.
Yeah. Well, that's reassuring. I think I read you saying somewhere that it would be okay if we were just reading translations of Shakespeare and Chaucer, and that got me pretty upset.
I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I mean, well, let me ask you something. Would you expect people to listen to the Canterbury Tales performed live?
My students, yeah, I would expect them to do
No, I
that.
mean
Yeah.
Mr. and Mrs. America,
Yeah.
weary theater goer.
No, they wouldn't be able to understand it because the language changed so
Yeah.
much. Well, so one reason that I hear what you're saying about the slang, and you're right. I think it does sort of churn. But another thing that you've written about, and that it's a big cause of language change, is migration. So that's the reason that when the Vikings came, they were too old to learn the language that was spoken in England.
Yeah, so they broke it.
They had a simplified version of it. And this is your academic specialty is Creoles and the second language acquisition. So since we're living in a world today that has so much migration, and people of all different ages all over the world moving from one country to another, so much political upheaval, do you think that could accelerate language change and lead to maybe even a more significant difference over time than even, the social media?
If there is education and literacy, then despite all of the movings around, the children of the people learn to speak at least a colloquial version of the local language. There's an extent to which immigrant kids in many places are coming up with new versions of, say, German or Swahili or Danish, because they all spend more time with each other than with the natives, and they've grown up listening to their parents speaking the Viking version of the language. Yeah. So the in-group language of a lot of these kids ends up being a kind of grammatically abbreviated and very slangy kind of register. Linguists call those multi-ethnolects. In the real world, they're not called anything. Basically, in each country, they're called shit. But actually, that is going to be a worldwide phenomenon, I think. Quick sidebar, and I'm going to admit something. Shakespeare, I have seen The Tempest 3 times live. And the 3 times that I saw it, it might as well have been in Korean. And then I decided I'm going to read it, and then I'll understand. And then I went to another production. Having read it, I thought it was splendid. And I'm kind of a language person. I'm a man of the theater. But frankly, I had no idea what The Tempest was about 3 times into my 40s. Tell no one and keep that recording under wraps. And so that's why I say Shakespeare needs to be adjusted, because I knew what all the words were. I couldn't get it. And I figured I'm just normal. So that's why I say what I say about Shakespeare.
Right. Yeah, it's actually kind of an interesting thing, and maybe a mistake that Shakespeare is taught in high schools.
What do you mean?
Just because there's lots of older literature that high school students could be reading.
And understanding.
Shakespeare is really hard.
Very hard.
Teaching Romeo and Juliet to ninth graders just because they're the same age as the characters, it seems like it might make more sense to read some sonnets, and analyze them than to try to master a whole play. And yet, that's the one piece of early literature that students have read when they come to college.
Wherefore art thou Romeo? Wherefore art thou? And that's not what it means. Why are you Romeo? That's just right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Or, there are other things that they could read.
Yeah.
Or King Lear is another one that threw me until I read it. I remember being given King Lear in high school, middle school, actually, and finding it a noble idea. Here's this king, and he's got these 3 daughters, and one of them is a little more interesting than the other 2. But I couldn't get it until I sat down and read it. And so that's the thing. Shakespeare needs to be taught more carefully that way, I think.
Yeah. So as I mentioned to you before we started talking, my very favorite book of yours, because it made the biggest difference in my own understanding of language, is Talking Back, Talking Black, or is it the reverse? Which comes first? Your book about black dialect.
Remember, that title was my editor's.
Talking Black, Talking Back.
I think it's Talking Back, Talking Black. Yeah. I never, frankly, knew what that meant. But yes, I remember the book. Yeah. Talking Back, Talking Black.
Yeah. So this is about another, it's not a Creole, but another subgenre or sub-part of the English language. And I was really persuaded by that book to develop more respect for Black English and to really regard it as, a separate dialect that takes skill to master and that should be respected alongside standard English. So I love that book. But a question that arises from it for me is who gets to talk Black? I think it's such an appealing dialect that lots of young people want to talk Black. It's just a lot of fun. It's a very lively way of speaking. So what do you think about that? Is that appropriation? If a white person talks Black, should that person maybe be more respectful of the cultural identity of that dialect and, stay in their own lane?
The good answer to that is yes, people should stay in their own lane and not appropriate a dialect spoken by people who haven't had the experience that you have had in society. This is one of those things where I understand where that answer comes from, but it's not possible. There's no way to police that. I understand why some people would want to. But the truth is that it's gotten to the point that there are people, basically 40 and under, who especially grew up with rap and hip-hop as default music. That was their music. And so you have those voices, plus today's technology, those rhythms in your ear all the time. Racism exists, but the color line is much thinner now than it was when I was in college. And so you also probably know, and know well, some Black people you probably date across the color line. To say that all of that is going to happen, and yet people aren't going to share dialectal features, is to deny the nature of how human beings use language. There'd just be no way for that to happen. And so I think people can be reassured in that the real full-blown Black English is going to be spoken by Black people. It's rare that a white person does that. It happens if they've had an unusual life experience. But really, we're talking about aspects of expressions and cadence and rhythm. But it's not the real thing. And I see that increasingly brown aspect of white speech as something that just shows that things are not the way they were. And I'm not going to say 1910, I can't believe I'm 60, but I remember 45 years ago very clearly. It's much different now. And, life was in color. We had electricity, et cetera. It wasn't some distant time.
I'm older than you.
You
Convince me.
Yeah. So it's not in the black and white times, but yeah, things are much different. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to use those same two TAs again, these very nerdy white boys. Both of them, when they greet each other, I just learned this expression from my 14-year-old. They dap one another up. And so they do that. They don't.
What's that called? Dap?
It's called, hey, dap me up.
Dap?
Is it dab or dap? Dap. Dap me up. And so he dapped me up, and they go like that. That used to be something black men did at the barber shop. And now Benjamin and Jacob are doing that. That's actually their names. And they have no idea. And they're doing the little one-armed hug and everything. And both of them go into black cadence to make a joke or something like that.
Yeah.
It's because they're 7 years old. You know, they're in a different, they're literally 20 years old.
Yeah.
They have grown up in such a different place. I can't see them as appropriating, especially since they are both very sensitive to what truly offensive appropriation would be.
Right.
Language is changing in that way. Language is browner. I always thought that was good.
So I'm going to move that into a little bit more of a radioactive area. You make a distinction in the book about Black English between two different versions of the N-word. One of which is a really offensive slur, and the other of which is pronounced slightly differently, but is more of an affectionate, comradely term. So what would you think about a white person using that second version?
No.
Is that okay?
No.
Okay.
And
So there's a limit to this
Yep.
openness to cultural appropriation. Yeah.
that word, simply because feelings about that word are so powerful and so unreachable and understandable that, you have to put a patch on things. There's some things that just aren't going to make pure logical sense. I fully get, if I put myself into the minds, let's use Ben and Jacob again, I'm sure that they wish they could call each other that word.
Yeah.
That's the way they treat each other. It's like buddy,
Right.
buddy, buddy. But no, they never would, for one thing.
Right.
And it would make me a little uncomfortable if they did. And no. So, that sometimes you have a kludge, as we call it.
Yeah.
Not the N-word, but with pretty much anything else.
Right. So how does one maintain the discreteness of an exception like that? So I understand that, I'm not using the word myself, I'm saying the N-word. I understand that there's a huge amount of sensitivity around that word. But then it feels like with that word and with any other word, whether it's homeless or, even, words that were considered to be more offensive, it starts to creep out, So I don't even know whether this word is appropriate to say, but the word Negro, which used to be a very respectable word, now it feels like that word is starting to get some of the charge, and one wonders if you're allowed to use it anymore. Or the use-mention distinction, which used to be pretty active, so that you could read a speech that was a great speech that somebody had made, or a book that was a great novel that had that word in it, and you could read it out loud, but now that's taboo. Or going back to Chaucer, there's a word in Middle English. There was no N-word in the 14th century. But there's a word in Middle English that sounds like it. It's a Scandinavian word that means stingy. And it occurs in Chaucer repeatedly, and it's actually an important word because it's one of the ways that the Wife of Bath's tale is related to the Shipman's tale, is related to the Nun's Priest tale. And when I teach those tales, I want to focus on that word because that is the chief complaint that Chaucer's women have against men is that they're miserly and stingy. And they use the same language to describe it across different tales. But I can't use it because I'm afraid that a student won't know it's not the same word and that I'll be in trouble. And there's actually a Wikipedia page about people getting in trouble.
That's happened twice.
Yeah, people have gotten in trouble for making reference to this word that is etymologically and linguistically totally unrelated and not being used in the same way. So how do we prevent the way that words gain a stigma and radioactive charge from starting to spill over into other words and really starting to interfere with our ability to, to read a great novel or study a great speech or look at all the language in an old poem?
Negro. The idea that that's a bad word, I'm sorry, but it's absurd. I have no toleration for it. I use it in my classes. I don't apologize beforehand. Of course, maybe I seem like I have an excuse, but I would never use the N-word itself. As you say, it's gotten to the point that you can't even mention it. I'm black myself. I would never use the word in class. But for Negro, which is a perfectly respectable word, just a little bit antique, the idea that it's insulting to refer to someone by an antique name or that it's wrong to read that out when you're reading something that Martin Luther King wrote or that James P. Johnson said, to be honest, I think, once again, this is human and understandable, but in this case, has to be resisted. I think there's some people who feel that it's their responsibility to look for something to be offended about. And with Negro, I say we've got to let it go. I've seen 2 people be fired for using the word Negro, and that's just ridiculous. On the word niggardly, that awkward word, I've thought about that often. And I've thought, again, the kludge. It's so awkward and it's so obscure that I've often thought I can understand maybe just retiring that word, although 2 people were one person was called up before the board, another person was fired and then rehired for using it by people who had never heard of it. And I've often thought, okay, it's obscure, it sounds exactly like the N-word, maybe just let that one go. I didn't know how central it was to, for example, your teaching, that's harder, where you kind of need to discuss that particular word. I can imagine if I were doing it, I would say it one time, and I'd say this word has nothing to do with the N-word, but I'm not going to say it over and over again, and then I would just say this word. But I would assume the students could tolerate seeing it on the page, knowing that the resemblance is accidental. But it is a very awkward word, and we have too many words sometimes. Stingy will do. Maybe we don't need that explicit synonym. Explicit isn't the word I wanted. Maybe let's rewind. Go back. So maybe we don't need that exact synonym, which is what it is. Miserly is a little different, but that other word really is just stingy, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can let that go.
I used to, in my classes, draw attention to it and say, this word looks like another word, but it's not that word, and it has a different history, and this is what it means. And then I just decided that it wasted time. Like, there wasn't enough time to talk about everything. Why get, distracted by this one word? I just let it go. But it means there's certain things I can't talk about in the poetry.
I think you should talk. You should just not say it, or say it once, but then teach it. I think people can stand to see it on the page. I would hope,
Yeah, well, it is on the page, so
yeah, it's not going to go away.
Yeah, I'd have to make a new edition. So in your writing, your audience, well, you've written many different kinds of books, and you write in many different genres. You write newspaper articles, you write full-length books, you've written scholarly articles and books. But it seems like your favorite audience is the educated lay public, as opposed to other professional linguists. Not that you never write for other professional linguists, but I'm wondering why that is. If you are impatient with the esoteric isolation of scholarly writing and you really have a desire to speak to a wider audience, or, did you make a decision at some point in your career that you would mostly do public writing and not really do writing for scholars, and if so, why?
That's kind of complicated. What I wanted to be when I grew up, starting at 5, was I wanted to write nonfiction books that would be rather widely read. I didn't know the term nonfiction, but at 5, I told my mother I want to be a book writer. And what I meant by book writer was I was writing books about, say, the human body. This page has lung, liver. That's what I actually wanted to do. Dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rex. Here's a book, Mommy. I wanted to do that. And as I got older, I really admired Stephen Jay Gould, the natural history writer. I love the way he wrote, and I thought, I want to do that. But then I also, when I was really of age, knew that the only thing I could do as a living was be a professor. And so that means writing for, 35 or 40 people. And to be honest,
That's lucky.
frankly, if you get that, if 2 people,
Yeah.
people who review it don't read it. But I have a pretty long CV because I really enjoy writing academic articles with the tapeworm sentences and the detailed argumentation. I'm beginning to put it in the past tense because now I do it only about once a year, it's every 2 at this point. But I really didn't want it to get to that point because I really love doing it. But yes, let's face it, it has a smaller audience, and in particular, and this is probably a little too much, but one of the things that I've done the most academically is Creole studies. And Creole studies, unfortunately, I mean, if I could rewind the tape, I would not do Creole studies because it's a field that is just torn to pieces by, I hate to say, it's a cliche if I say it, but wokeness grabbed Creole studies in 1999. And so you're not allowed to amass facts or present any theory that doesn't adhere to a certain nationalist script. And so, to be honest, I was a leader in Creole studies, but to the extent that I was the one to hate. And so the idea is prove, and not socially, except for this one person, but the idea is...
We want to hear more about that.
We haven't spoken since 1999, but the idea is that I'm the one to criticize, to show that I'm wrong, which I'm not. And after a while, it gets kind of wearing, and I started to think, I'm tired of writing these papers, which nobody reads at this point because they think that I'm not worth listening to. And that made me think, okay, I'm flying blind here. I've never really thought about this before, but once I realized that there was no point in communicating with the Creolists anymore, and I wrote a book, The Creole Debate, which was basically my mic drop, and that was now 9 years ago. I thought, now I'm really going to concentrate on writing the nonfiction books because at least you actually get read. But I missed the academic writing. Like I'm trying to write a paper now about Mandarin, of all things, and I just figure I'm out of my lane, but at least I'll be listened to because they don't hate me. And so I'm going to do that, and there's novelty, and I'm sitting there writing those long sentences and making the close argumentation and making sure to have read 3 or 4 things for each point I make. Oh, it feels so complete. Whereas with a book these days, frankly, I don't know how I write them so quickly. It's not as fulfilling because all I have to do is drink some bourbon and sit on a porch for 3 months. And then the book is just done. Pronoun Trouble was just gulp, bang. And that's not as...
I wish I could do that.
And the truth, that really is the truth. Woke racism was all bourbon, anger, and that sun porch, just boom. And then the least satisfying, I shouldn't say this on the record, but writing a column for a newspaper every week, 1, you have to think of what the topic's going to be. And 2, you have to write the way they want. They want these goddamn punchy Walter Winchell sentences. And that's not the way I prefer to write. And you learn to write that way, but it's not fun. Like right now, one of them, I already forget what the one yesterday was, but today is Friday. I have to pitch whatever it's going to be next week. And I'm just thinking, I have to pitch it, they have to accept it, and then I have to write in these little sentences. And that is not natural, and if you try to drink and do it, the sentences just get too long. So, but no, actually, I really do love academic writing. It's just that I kind of had to stop doing it.
Well, your answer to that question really surprises me, and it makes me very curious to know what the Creole debate is. Like, what are the 2 sides of it? Can you boil it down to, because
A neat exercise. Yeah, I'm going to boil it down in a way that a normal person would understand and find it interesting. If you see on the page French itself, and then Haitian Creole itself. And if you're familiar with French, Haitian Creole looks like French with all of the hard stuff stripped out. It's like a better French in a way. And the reason for that is that African slaves, enslaved people, frankly, that's another example, but African enslaved people were brought to Haiti speaking their own languages. They had to learn enough French to get by. Nobody was teaching it to them with Duolingo or something like that. So what you get is several hundred words and some shards of grammar. You take that and you make it into a new language. And next thing you know, Haitian Creole has its own grammar. But it did begin with a pidgin. It began with people who were deprived of language training, desperately making something into a new language. The evidence for that, having happened with Creole languages worldwide, is devastatingly clear. I mean, there's really no argument, and that's not my bias. It's painfully obvious that's what happened. I made that point in 1998, assuming that everybody would agree. I didn't think I was saying anything deep, but it turned out that I had stepped on toes. You're supposed to say that Haitian Creole is a mixture of French and African languages, period. So, and that nothing went on in terms of pidgin. It wasn't that anybody didn't learn anything. It's not simplification. It's not that Haitian Creole has a very approachable grammar because of all that French. No offense to anybody who's French, I love French, but all of that French language junk that got squeezed out, the subjunctive and the gender that doesn't mean anything, all of that is gone in Haitian Creole. Now, it's got plenty of grammatical features of its own that French doesn't have, but frankly, not like French, because French is amassed with what older languages get gunked up with, just like English. English, am, is, are, were, what the hell is that? That shows that English is ancient. Haitian Creole is new. So I'm a racist because I say that these are languages where language was broken and then born again. Whereas they say, no, that's a mistake. It's really just that language is mixed together. When, and I am very close to done, when there are examples all over the world of what happens when that happens. Those languages don't have a group name, but we know what happens when languages just blend. And that's not what Haitian Creole is. And frankly, ears are just closed. And a lot of these people are very nice. I don't go to the conferences anymore, but I miss them.
They're not going to agree with your article.
But they'll never read them. And that's the thing. I started to realize after a while I am writing into the wind. And not a single one of those people has read the Creole debate. And so I just figured there is a lot of richness in this life, and so I'm just going to pick up my marbles and go home. And I learned a lot. I'm one of the world's Creolists, but no, I can't do that if I'm not going to be read, especially because of that one person. So, here we are.
Outside of your academic writing, what is the thing that the book that you've written or the theory that you've proposed that's gotten you in the most trouble? Or that's excited the biggest backlash or response?
Well, way back in 2000, the book that maybe put me on whatever map there is was Losing the Race, and the subtitle was Self-Sabotage in Black America. The editor did the subtitle, but I can't say that that's not what the book was about. And that one made me persona non grata among a great many people for a long time, and there are people who still hate me for that one. And what I was saying was that what was concerning me was black students and underperformance and what the reason is if it's not IQ, which it isn't. And I was trying to say that many black kids come to school with a sense that they inherit from teen black culture that school is for other people, that you are acting white. That wasn't my original observation by any means, but I aired it and aired that it was very much true based on not only my own experience, but from studies and from what I saw with students who I was teaching at UC Berkeley at the time. And I did several vignettes about students I had known, always with the specifics and gender changed to make sure it didn't seem like somebody who was still around. But I need to tell some real stories. And I wrote about why people would consider themselves subject to different kinds of evaluation, why you would think that one thing is okay for you but not for other people, where the sense of victimhood comes in as a kind of pride rather than as something to minimize, which is what people often do. Sometimes it's not good to minimize, but that's the normal response. So I wrote about those things, and I didn't pull any punches. I tried to write it as warmly as I could. I did not like my black students. I was worried about them. But I wrote that. And that was considered the wrong thing. People thought that I didn't understand how deeply racism infuses society. Many didn't want me to write that where white people could read it. A lot of black people said, yes, this is true, but don't tell them. And also, I was 32 or 33. And I had this same arrogant, overconfident voice, but it didn't come off as well when I was a kid. And so I seemed like this young, snooty, white-sounding, arrogant person who thinks he knows so much. He's a linguist. He's not a social scientist anyway. Who the hell is he? And when I first started, it's a lesson that I tried to learn once I realized the problem. I had a happy warrior thing about me. I don't watch myself in old stuff very much, but about a year ago, I did take a look at me on C-SPAN in a little suit in like 2001, kind of enjoying how smart I am, and that does not work. The happy warrior routine is bad. And so I've learned, because I don't feel like that. I'm not taking joy in saying that here are things black people are doing wrong. That's what it looked like. So, yeah, I'd gotten a lot of trouble for that. It surprises me how little it affected me. There's something wrong with me in a way, but out at Berkeley, people would be yelling at me on the street. I had people coming to my office, leaving crank messages on my phone. Most of my life then was being a happy Creolist, not realizing what was coming, and doing a lot of theater and having a lot of relationships. That's what life felt like. But there was also that I was hated for that. And there's still people out there who hate me for that book. But it's been a while, and I've learned some lessons about presentation and how you phrase things. But that was me. I was a pup then.
You're very you've been very open and forthcoming about a lot of things. One that's related to what you were just talking about is the unintended negative consequences of affirmative action. And this is something that I don't have as much experience with this as you, but when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, there were very few women. There were no tenured women in the department that I was in. I felt that I was being looked down upon a lot. And so part of me was really grateful that there seemed to be, a move. Now that department is 50% tenured women, 40 years later. And part of that is the result of affirmative actions to try to get more women into their jobs. But the minute that I was hired at Wellesley, I heard a rumor that I had just gotten the job because I was a woman. And, I know who started that rumor, and I don't think it was true, and I know who that was told to, and I think it was an attempt to make that person feel better about having not very much success on the job market, so I think the motivation was good. But it made me feel like nothing that I could achieve at that particular moment would be my own, attributed to my own talents. So I could see the downside of this leg up that I was also grateful for. Then I came to Wellesley. Wellesley is an all-women environment. It has never had a man president. Most of the faculty are women. It felt totally different, and it sort of like removed this terrible shadow that had been bothering me, in which my sex was the most important thing about me. Suddenly I could compete on my own. So I wonder what your thoughts are about the pros and the cons of trying to compensate for disadvantage by giving people a little bit of advantage in the present. And, how that relates to, say, maybe black universities or black schools, or as the father of daughters, would you consider sending one of your daughters to Wellesley because she wouldn't have to cope with the, difficulties of feeling like she was getting some special privilege because of being female, because everyone is. That's a long question.
No, I get it. It's funny. The other day I was walking with them past Barnard. I brought them to school. And which one said? The 14-year-old said, "Why are there only girls there?" And then I had to explain. And I thought that it's an interesting history. I think that if there is disadvantage and therefore there are way too few people of some group in an institution, well, chances are that the human thing to do is to adjust your sense of what standards are to an extent and to make it so that more people can be there and get their sea legs and serve as role models. I think that that is a huge moral advance that started in this country. I can't think of anywhere else that did that before the United States did it. It's important, but it should be time limited. The idea that you keep doing that until racism and even disadvantage don't exist, again, understandable. But the problem is that the downsides of what that sense of some people having been admitted under different standards creates, they're so pervasive and they're so ineradicable that you can't do it forever. If affirmative action in, say, universities starts, let's call it 1970, although that's a little bit late, I would think that if I were running the show, it would have been, let's do this until 1990. And then, unfortunately, we're going to have to let it go. And in general, the standards changing, it should only be so much because, Lord forbid, you end up having a two-tier system and everybody can see it. And so, for example, I taught one class at Berkeley. It was a small class, and there were, two white, for no reason at all, it happened to be all women. I never thought about that until right now. But there were 2 white women, and there were 6 black women. The 2 white women sat there, watched me, did the reading, and they got A's. They just sat there, they did it. With the other women, that was not the case, and they were on a completely different level of preparation, of attitude towards the material, and it was a class on pigeons and creoles, so it wasn't that it was racially, distant or something like that. And just, they were great, but I couldn't teach them the way I taught the white ones. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure that these particular black students should be here as opposed to at UC San Diego. I thought this would be better because, and this is what you're not supposed to say, but I think everybody sees it. If it's that stark, if I have to ask one of them to leave because she doesn't come to the midterm because she went to a party and comes in and actually tells me while eating a slice of pizza, and I have to actually say, I'm sorry, but you have to withdraw. The 2 white girls weren't going to do that. And I thought the white girls are watching this, and what are they going to think if this is what they see? Now, this is Berkeley now 35 years ago. That's not what it's like now. But I didn't like seeing that. And I also didn't like that what was done to me was kind of like what was done to you. I came out of grad school. I'm an autodidact, and I did a lot of theater. I knew exactly what I had to do to do my dissertation, but I was extremely uncooked. I really didn't deserve an Ivy League linguistics job, and that's not false humility. I really wasn't up to snuff yet. I got a job at Cornell because of the color of my skin, and I looked like a complete idiot. And the thing is, I'm going to tell it this way because it's okay, because it's just here. I went to grad school with 2 other black students. It was lucky that we were in a grad program in linguistics where there were 3 black people coming through. The other 2, God bless them, were even less cooked than me, and they weren't really terribly interested in linguistics, but they were passed along in a way that white grad students, we're talking 90s, white grad students who in their position were not. White ones were asked to leave, not the other 2. Both of them got tenure-track jobs right out of school, just as I did. And the truth is, Once I realized that I was in a bad situation, because I'm a Montessori kid and because I do love linguistics, I thought I'm going to get up to snuff. And I really went into the woodshed for about 2 years. Now, I don't think any linguists think that I'm at the top of the profession, but I'm normal. You know, I can have a conversation with any linguist and they don't think he's not qualified. I made myself that way, but the thing is, I'm weird. The other two didn't do that. And one of them in particular is still in that position. That person got tenure that in no sense made any sense based on why you get tenure. They got tenure because they were black. And they're a role model for students who watch this person who never publishes, who gives very haphazard lectures. I am very fond of this person, but nevertheless, this is true. And I have spoken to department members where they will sometimes mention this person, and it's clear what they think, and it's clear that they know that that person has a job only because of the color of their skin. I don't think that's good. And the thing is, you watch something like that, and I'll never write about them because they don't deserve it. None of us could help anything that was going on around us. We couldn't help that we got jobs that we weren't up for. But and so it's just, for me, you do it for a while, but then after that, no, because it creates situations like that.
Yeah. I have many more questions, but I think I'm supposed to let other people have a turn. So
These are good questions.
yeah, well, you can take these home with you. I'm on email. So I think, is there somebody who's going to go? Okay, great. There's a mic that's circulating, and I think members of the audience might have questions they want to ask you. Yeah.
Okay, hello. So I am thinking a lot about your story about Benjamin and Jacob, I think are their names, and how you kind of mentioned like the N-word is off limits, but they really wish they could say it. And it reminds me...
I'm guessing that they did.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot about like certain really appropriative trends that are happening on TikTok and social media a lot. The first thing that comes to mind is because of the rise of AI, people started using clanker as a slur against AI and robots as if they are people. But my point is that clanker is obviously a stand-in for like other types of slurs and words, and it's kind of just like a funny haha thing. But I guess the question is, do you think that the larger trend that we're seeing of very small appropriative trends that do fizzle out is going to continue? Like, is this just the new norm for people in my generation? Are we going to, I guess, I don't know, keep having this kind of attitude towards Black English and Black people, and that it's like, okay, there are certain things that we can kind of change around to make it okay for us to say these things?
Well, yeah, because I think part of human nature is, especially when you're younger, is naughtiness and pushing boundaries. There are always going to be people who want to do it, especially because these phones give you these private spaces. To the extent that things like that are considered naughty, there will always be people who do it. There will always be Nelson Muntz on The Simpsons. You know, that is a human universal. So I'm not saying that it's good, but I would assume that we would just keep seeing things like this, and hopefully, they get plowed under. A clanker is a what? I just like to know these things.
It's a slur against robots. And people will often drop the ER and change it to A, so, it's
So
okay.
an analogy. Mm-hmm. That's ha-ha. Yeah, okay. Why would there be a slur against a robot? What? You mean like an AI?
Yeah, AI, it's predictive for when AI takes over in the future, and then they are people that we can use these slurs against them when they are cognizant.
Oh,
makes total sense.
You must admit that's creative, but yes, it's going to continue.
Okay. I didn't think about how to phrase this beforehand, but I guess I'm curious about how you've spoken about when we try to intentionally change certain things about a language and how they don't really stick. Language evolves around its speakers, and I'm curious about if you think that there is a place for intentionally changing language, certain words or certain phrases or pronunciation or whatever. If you think there is a place for that, and if you think there's a way that we could be doing that we're not doing, and that could be for accessibility, that could be for making people feel more comfortable and changing certain ways that we refer to them or something like that. But I'm curious about, because I've always thought of it as there are certain things that stick better than others, but I think it is a valiant effort to try and change certain things to make spaces more inclusive. But I also think that there are a lot of really embarrassing examples of how we've tried to do that and how it doesn't stick, and how we try to do that maybe for other languages, and the words that we use don't even fit in the context of those other languages. And so yeah, I'm curious about that part of what you were talking about specifically.
Instead of saying that it's where you draw the line, I'm going to give a question back to you, which is intended constructively. Okay. And that is, and it's kind of a rhetorical question, but if you go back into activist circles, leftist activist circles, let's make it 1960. So everybody is drinking martinis, they've got the cat-eyed glasses, smoking. These are real people, and so they're not in a black and white picture, it's in color, they're moving around, they're eating. So these are people. And if we went back and hung out with them, the thing that we would find missing is so much concern about language. People would be talking about activism, where we're going to do this, we're going to do that. The question is, given how much change there's been since 1960, in terms of sexism, in terms of racism, in terms of ableism, et cetera, although there's still a long way to go. Given that so much happened that those people did, and they didn't even have an internet, what is the advantage today of focusing on language? That is the question that I would ask, very well-meaning you in that sense. And I don't know if there's an answer, but my sense is if Pauli Murray and A. Philip Randolph were not thinking about language, but about government and meetings and doing, I'm not sure what they were missing. That's my thing. So I would just think about that. And therefore, I'm sorry to interrupt, and therefore maybe slogans rather than saying, don't say this word. Go ahead.
I agree that there's a lot more concrete actions to be made, and that those are most often more impactful than changing language. I guess that's kind of where my question lies of, do you think there is a place for still changing language, even if it's not the most impactful way about it? Or I think maybe I'm projecting a little bit, but that you think it's more of a distraction than anything else from real action taking place?
I would slip it in. Well, actually, like we were saying, if society seems to be leaning that way anyway, and so with feminist language, it took partly because of changing concepts, which Betty Friedan probably, if we're talking about second wave, she created the conditions where calling someone a male chauvinist pig, which I just remember, really shook a man to his bones, where if you had called a man that in 1935, he would have just said F you. But in 1972, you didn't want to be called that anyway. And so then Ms. and chair, et cetera. But for things where you're really giving people a brand new concept, I'm just not sure that language works. That's the thing. I'm not sure it works. It's not that it's offensive, but I don't know if it's effective.
I think I agree, especially with when it's focused on written language, because I think there are a lot of ways that we try and spell, like when people spell women with an X so that it doesn't include the word men in it. That doesn't change how I'm going to say it. And I think the power of language, except for historical purposes, maybe you disagree, but the power of language, at least in the now, is spoken language as communication, and it's not so much the written. So
real language is talking. Yeah, exactly.
So, well, you'll excuse me if this seems like a hostile question, because well, it kind of is. So you are prone to deride as grammar grouches, to use a term from the title of a book to which you wrote the foreword, I believe.
I probably did.
People who advocate for adherence to, sort of norms and conventions that make written language more legible, more understandable, and yet, in your own writing, you don't write for all intensive purposes. When you mean for all intents and purposes, you consistently use less for amount nouns and fewer for count nouns. Your sentences, you don't put comma splices in your sentences. And to remind you of what you wrote about most recently, you're advocating for dangling participles, but...
well, that was the last one. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. But they're actually quite rare in your own writing. So I'm wondering how to understand, excuse me, the discrepancy between your, as I say, the scorn that you exhibit toward people who are advocates of certain norms of standard written English, and yet your own adherence to those exact same norms in your own writing.
My interest is not in whether or not language is clear or understandable. The issue is rules that don't make any sense. And so often with the danglers, it's not that you don't understand, it's that somebody has told you that the dangling thing has to agree with the subject because that's the way it works in Latin. And, well, this isn't Latin. And so the issue is whether or not you understand. But your question makes perfect sense, and I can imagine how it looks from your end, that I'm saying, let's stop paying attention to these rules that people in wigs and stockings made up by candlelight 250 years ago and then dropped dead of yellow fever. Why are we listening to them? But remember that everything you see by me, especially if it's in a newspaper or a magazine, has been submitted to the arbitrary directives of the House style. So the New York Times wouldn't let me do a lot of those things. You should see what the copy I send often looks like. Or it gets to the point where I keep myself in trim because I know what they're going to fix anyway. But I'm not advocating this, but if you read my books, in the books it's more my particular voice, and I throw out a lot of stuff. And so there's that. But really, it's a matter of the editing and also what hill you want to die on. And so, for example, Him and Me went to a concert. That to me sounds like chocolate. It's perfect. It's normal English. Nobody had any problem with it until about 150 years ago. Him and Me went to the store. But if I write that, even in one of my books, if I may, because I can tell you have a sense of humor, you reading it would be mad. And I'm trying to make a point. I want you to understand something about some verb or something like that. So I'm not going to write Him and Me because I'm not going to die on that hill. So there's that part too.
One of the examples you gave of the dangling modifiers, though, was, I think it was, I'm not going to get it exactly.
Remind me.
It was walking up the hill, the flowers were in bloom or something.
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, that could be a really interesting thing if you think of the flowers as walking up the hill. So it's not clear that it's the person walking up the hill. It could be the flowers walking up the hill.
Well, if you're-
and you only know that if you're using it precisely the way that Vernon is suggesting.
Would you really imagine the flowers walking up the hill?
Yeah, I mean, that's poetry.
Sounds like a Fleischer cartoon. Well, the Chinese think that sentence is fantastic. That was the point, that in Mandarin you can put it that way, and nobody says, oh, where's the subject? And so I'm wondering why we can't be more Chinese.
Yes.
I'm wondering what percentage of white Americans do you think fully realize that African American English is a distinct dialect?
Many more than in 1996 when the Oakland School District Ebonics controversy happened, when basically the whole country just laughed at the idea that Ebonics was a dialect. And because some linguists, including me, made it a mission to start getting that message
Like John
across.
Rickford.
John Rickford was the pioneer, and I remember he was my dissertation advisor, and he said that he said, you know, with this message, you have to understand a lot of our predecessors have been frustrated that they wrote one paper or they were in one magazine article and they said something once and the country never listened. He said it has to be Madison Avenue. You have to do it over and over again. Here I am 30 years
But still,
later.
like, what percentage of white Americans do you I mean, I think white Americans realize that many black people speak differently, but I think a lot of white people think that it's broken English. They think standard American English is how we speak English in the U.S. People in the UK, they have their way of speaking English. People in Australia have their way of speaking English. But I don't think there's widespread understanding that we have many dialects of English in the United States, and they're linguistically on a par. And I think in the criminal justice system, for example, it's outrageous that if Spanish is your first language, you get a translator. If African American English is your first language, you don't. And people are very much misunderstood, and the court reporters are not trained in African American English. So I'm asking you how we've made progress since Oakland. How much more progress do we need to make for it to be even for the meta ignorance about dialectical difference to be gone?
As you can tell, I have no figures, but I would say in all honesty that compared to 1996, I feel like we're half of the way there. It's mostly educated people, but the idea that Ebonics is more than just what up and the word bitch and all those things from 96, that no longer ruffles feathers when somebody like me writes about it the way it used to. The thing with the courts, that is a really important issue, and I actually talk about passing it on. I have a student, black Black English specialists are vanishingly rare. There was one initial generation in the 70s. It is a completely female field now, which is fine, but he might change that. And I told him, I said, Alex, I'm too busy, I'm getting weary, I'm not going to crusade about the court issue, but he says that he wants to. And so he's on it, and then there's this white guy who's on it, Taylor Jones, because that's important. People are misunderstood on trial because nobody understands that they're using a different dialect. But goodness, it's better than it used to be. You remember all those stupid jokes about Ebonics? I think that whole issue would go very differently if it happened again now. But I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna. Yes, it's not. I would say it's about this far.
Thank you.
I have been following your work for decades. And
Good.
Remember your predecessor on language, William Safire, and thinking about just prominent linguists in the field. I'm thinking of Chomsky as well. What is it about being a linguist that you think makes one so ripe to be both a cultural commentator and particularly a political commentator?
I want to give a real answer, and I don't think it's going to be the one you want. I think it's really just an accident that certain linguists have taken it upon themselves to be public in that way. And I'm thinking about who all of us are and what we have in common, and we don't. Like, for example, Noam Chomsky has a very strong leftist message that he wanted to get out there. I don't think he savors celebrity, but he also is a genius, although I can't stand his work. But it's the product of genius. He's a genius linguist. George Lakoff is another genius linguist, and he wanted to be famous because that's the kind of person that he is. He would tell me that. And so he tried to step outside because he's that kind of personality. I love language, but also have opinions about race and a bunch of other things, and I like to get my opinion out. Like John Rickford said, the thing about you, John, is if you get upset, you write a book. That's true. And so I need to get it out there. And so there's that. And then, and also, neither Noam nor George would say this. If I'm interested in something linguistic, for me it's toys. It's like, oh, that's neat. And I want to share it in a way that somebody normal could understand. Here, enjoy this with me. Deborah Tannen is, she does it because she loves linguistics, and she, in a different way than George Lakoff, she wanted to be famous. She wanted to be on TV, not in an offensive way, but she wanted, no. Sorry, you guys are watching me work this out. I've never thought about it. Deborah got in trouble within her own field and decided to take it to the streets. She's told me that. So, yeah. I think we're all very different stories, really. I think that linguistics is big enough that by chance there would have to be a few who took it to the streets, so to speak. But all the public linguists have never been in a room together, have we? No, no.
You briefly spoke about languages developing in isolation and how they'll rapidly progress without a writing system. I'm curious if a writing system is introduced to those languages, like, I don't know if this is actually like a plausible scenario.
No, this is going to be good. Keep going.
Like how that writing system will develop slash like record those changes, and how much will they slow down versus speed up, like according to what was previously happening before the writing system.
It's so funny you asked that. I was talking about that in a lecture 48 hours ago at Columbia, and on the Acela up here, I was reading about that happening to another language, so I can actually say something coherent, which is that if you're dealing with an isolated oral language, and then somebody comes along and says, let's have a writing system. There's often some slightly peculiar, inspired person who says, here, we're gonna write it down. What really happens is that if writing really takes hold in the culture, it tends to be the surrounding system. And so there was a Creole language in Suriname where a guy made up a writing system. But really, if anybody does write Juka, it's with Dutch orthography. The same thing with Cherokee's wonderful writing system here. It's more a cultural thing than something that people use a whole lot for communication, and it tends to stay that way. However, one thing that you do see again and again is that when that writing system comes in, it sits and stays the way it is, and the language just keeps on changing. And so this Creole spoken in the rainforest in Suriname, the guy made it up in 1910, and it reflects the Juka of 1910, and it's just stayed that way. The language has lost consonants and gained constructions and things, and the script just kind of sits there, which unfortunately makes it less relevant to the newer generations, and so they just want to write in Dutch, if they write the language at all. So that's the answer to that question. It tends to, the new system floats in, people enjoy it as a novelty, but it does not change with the language itself, because writing is inherently conservative, even if it's a new system brought into a smaller language. And I can't think of an exception to that. I don't know everything on writing systems, but the 4 examples I can think of, that's what happens. What made you ask that, if I may?
I don't know. It was something that stuck out to me. My dad loves your podcast, and I remember that was an episode that he made me listen to. I enjoyed it. I came to the talk.
Tell your dad.
And so, yeah, I think it was something about how colors develop differently within isolation.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
And so that was something that always interested me.
Oh, the Colors show. I remember that, yeah, right.
He was like, Harp, you're going to love this one. I was like, okay. And I did think it was interesting.
It actually is.
So you brought up a little bit of the isolation, and I wanted to like grasp onto that and ask that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The Colors, that was way back. That was like 2017. Tell him I said hello. Oh, happy birthday, Dad.
So can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on Huckleberry Finn? Because, of course, Mark Twain was the anti-racist of his time, and his book will never be taught again, which I think is a shame. Because of one word.
Yeah, people write me about that all the time. I think that the way we've made the N-word a magic word is counterproductive, because the very first time I did media, I have it on something called a cassette, audio cassette. It was 1995, and it was a local Bay Area show about the N-word, and we were allowed to use the word, whatever color we were, within reason, if you're referring to it. I think I said it 3 times, and there wasn't a flinch. That was better. It made sense. Human beings are capable of understanding the distinction. It sets in around 2005 that you can't even say the word, and I'm not sure that it serves any purpose. Talk about dying on a hill. I've written that often, but I know it's not gonna change anything. But when it gets to Huckleberry Finn, I've had white dads It's always a guy who writes me about that for some reason. But white dad saying that they substitute like your dad. Oh, not your dad. Good, but substituting something for it, but that completely destroys the flavor of it. And a part of me wishes, and I write something different back to each one of them, but a part of me wishes they would just explain, this is a word that was used in a certain context. It has many meanings. Don't you ever say it out in the real world, which any kid knows, I think. And I would just do it. It makes me almost want to read it to my kids just out of spite. But no, I'm not going to do that because I don't think they want to be read to anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, when it gets to the point that you can't enjoy Huckleberry Finn, I think something's wrong, especially because Jim's language is so rich and dead accurate in terms of how black people of that time and place spoke. There are little subtleties in there that it's almost as if Twain was a linguist. He had a real ear. But now we can't use Jim. I regret it. It's not the way it should be.
So we are at time. Thank you very much to Kathy and John, but everybody should feel free to come up and continue the conversation with them.